And how many different people have some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection?
Biblical scholar Wes Huff presents Joe Rogan on the best argument and evidence for the resurrection he's ever heard.
Thing different that goes on there, that they're like, this is a miracle, right? Dead people don't usually rise from the dead.
So what is your personal belief when it comes to the resurrection? What do you think?
Oh, man, you guys don't understand how much joy this brings to my heart. Joe Rogan! Joe Rogan! Joe Rogan! This is the question.
Hello.
This is the question, Joe. We've been praying that you would ask.
Come on.
Again, I think the Lord's moving on Joe Rogan's heart. I've been making this case for 2 years, over 2 years.
You have.
Right?
I think you get your episode when Joe Rogan does come to Jesus and he looks at your back catalog and goes, man, I thought that was kind of annoying at first, but this man called it.
Yeah. And then I'm gonna need a call. All right. But this is the question. Again, not even for the sake of Rogan coming to Christ, which again, I believe that the Lord is moving on his heart. Mm-hmm. But for the sake of everyone else. What do you make of this Jesus? What do you, in light of a linear, logical, historical point, what do you make of this Jesus guy?
Do you have a belief, or do you just try to interpret the text and try to see what is the message?
Well, I think, so as a historian, I do think it is a historical question. You have a guy who objectively lived, he objectively died, and then individuals close to his inner circle claim that they see him not dead.
Right.
Again.
This is a highly unusual activity.
Highly
unusual.
Right.
To say the least. Now, what he's doing, Wes is doing right there, which is actually really brilliant, is he's appealing to the consensus of both Christian and secular scholarship.
Everyone agrees upon what he just said.
Everyone agrees. The idea that Jesus was a myth is a non-majority idea. It's not a populist idea. It's not a popular idea. It is a tucked away. Very few people are Jesus mythicists anymore. Most consensus within the scholarly secular realm, people would concede those 3 points. Jesus lived, Jesus died, and his disciples were convinced he rose.
But it's hard when you're dealing with illiterate populations, you're dealing with thousands of years of time, you're dealing with an oral tradition, and then you have us sitting here talking about it in 2024, trying to figure it at the end of 2024, trying to figure this out.
You shouldn't have dated the episode that way.
Did you notice that he brought up the oral tradition thing?
Yep.
And it's like, Joe, we covered this at 35-minute mark.
We covered this, but
you gotta drop that one, Joe.
Gotta drop the oral. There was an oral tradition, but the oral tradition was better preserved.
You gotta drop it as it being an issue.
Yeah.
That's
literally the end. It's very difficult for anybody who thinks of themselves as an intelligent person who's secular to even entertain the possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's
Hold on. So he's already saying we established there's a presupposition that we agree on that the world is not just this material world. That we are not just a bag of flesh and chemistry and blood, and we're just sitting here as just two evolved beings who all of a sudden got magical consciousness out of nowhere.
Yeah.
We've already agreed that there's something beyond the material. So at the very least, if you're listening closely, at the very least, Rogan has definitely moved on from anything close to secular materialism, anything close from secular humanism. He's moved on way beyond that.
I think he's in his Jordan Peterson stage from 2 years ago.
Maybe, or at the very least,
he had good things to say.
Yeah, at the very least, he's no longer an agnostic.
Yeah.
He is, at the very least, a deist or maybe even a theist. Now, we want to get him over to Christian theist, right? Yeah. But at the very least, he's there. So that's a massive W in and of itself. Go ahead.
The possibility that someone died and come back to life.
And I get that. But we've already talked about the fact that we don't think that the only thing that exists is matter and motion. We as in you and I, right? Like, we believe that there's something else going on in this world that's a little bit crazy.
There's something else,
and that to, I think, exclude that, I think excludes something that you're kind of putting blinders on for. And you do have, I mean, you're right in terms of all of these ancient.
Yeah, he's like, you can't say that there's something supernatural seemingly in all these other regions.
Yes.
Yet,
yes,
you're like, when it gets to this, you're like, I don't know. It just seems kind of crazy. It's like we talked about it with like the aliens or whatever, but then when it gets to Jesus, it's like, oh, it's impossible. And so Wes Huff is doing that really good thing, is just grounding it back to like, well, what do we agree on?
Yeah. That's good.
Conventions and the ways that things were spread around, but the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, and they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact checked those things.
So how do you fact check someone coming back from the dead?
Well, if you
How many people saw his body, right?
well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
Yes. It made it onto the show. The apologetic,
Yep.
the historical event
Yep.
that everyone that loves apologetics references
Yes.
when talking about the
1
resurrection.
Corinthians 15.
Yeah, and then watching Joe Rogan episodes for years and being like, but the 400 people that they talk about,
Yeah.
and it's boom.
And it's not just it's 500 people in 1 Corinthians 15 over the course of 40 days. That's that's the part people also forget, is that Jesus didn't just show up and reveal himself to a couple people. It said that he was on earth for 40 days, revealing himself to many people.
And so word is probably spreading.
Yeah, and word is spreading, hence Christianity is exploding. And all of these people would have been around, or many of them would have been around, while these letters were being spread out. That's why in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, hey, as some of you know and have seen out of the 500, but some have fallen asleep. Where he makes that distinction. Yeah, some of the 500 that saw him fell asleep, but there's some of you guys that are still around today.
Meaning some of them have died.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Some of them have died, but many of them are still alive.
You can still, 400 saw him, but you can still validate it with 300.
Yeah,
Boom.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
400 people saw the crucifixion.
No, saw the resurrected
resurrection.
Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once. I mean, if we read the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Luke and Acts, so same author wrote these both documents. He says that Jesus was walking around teaching them for 40 days after.
Look at me and Wes, kindred spirits, making the same points without it. I'm going in blind to this clip, so I didn't even know that. So,
Look at that.
resurrected from the dead. And so these are written within a time period when you have people who would have seen Jesus' ministry, who were there, say at something like the feeding of the 5,000, who could have been able to verify or debunk some of these things that are being said. And you go from a bunch of scared guys who, because Jesus wasn't the only messianic figure who arose and claimed to be the Messiah.
Right.
There were a number of individuals both prior to and after Jesus, but they die and the movement dies with them.
Do you think it's possible?
when these other Messiah-like figures, when these other saviors, when these other cult leaders, is because that's you would dismiss Jesus as that. When they die, the movements die. Yet with Jesus, movement doesn't die. It only increases. It only spreads.
Yeah.
That's great.
Hello.
Yeah.
That he didn't die? And do you think it's possible that they thought he was dead? Because that does happen. There was actually a case very recently where a guy was about to be harvested for organs. They thought he was dead, and this guy started moving again and came back to life. It's a very, very bizarre case because his family had been told that.
This is a great question from Joe. You gotta give Joe his flowers. He says, well, maybe Jesus wasn't really dead.
And I'm guessing that guy probably didn't predict that that would happen.
Yeah, he probably didn't predict that he would go to the cross.
Yeah, and then wake up from some crazy condition.
Yeah.
He
Well,
was.
let's see. My guess. Wes is probably gonna illustrate the utter horror of the crucifixion.
Yeah.
If I had to guess.
Going to be harvested for organs. They were preparing for that.
Yeah.
This guy comes back.
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot about Roman crucifixion.
Yeah.
And we
Pretty
know
brutal.
that, and we know that they did their job well.
Yeah.
And so,
That's a great way of putting it.
That's a great way of putting it. And to say because it's kind of funny, but it's not. It's actually really dark. It's one of those like we laugh to keep from crying, but it's actually
fact,
really really dark.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
if you look at, say, very skeptical biblical scholars, like non-believing, atheist, agnostic Christian scholars, they will say if we can know anything about Jesus, like they'll cast it down on a lot of the things that we read about in the Gospels in terms of the actual historical Jesus of Nazareth. They'll say one thing we can be sure of is that he died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate.
Let's go.
Because we have not just multiple attested documents that we refer to as the New Testament, but Roman and Greek and Jewish writers refer to that claim afterwards and talk about the fact that you have this guy, and it's mocked within earliest Christianity. So one of our earliest, in fact, not one of, the earliest depiction of Jesus on the cross is called the Alexamenos Graphido. And it's probably from the end of the 1st century. And it's it depicts an individual with their arms raised in an act of worship, worshiping a man with a donkey's head who's being crucified.
Wow, that shots at Christians right there because they were doing that to mock Christians. That's crazy. Yeah,
And right beside it says Alexamenos worships his God in Greek. And it's mocking, right? Yeah. Because crucifixion was for the lowest of the low. It was for like slaves. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen, you were banned from being crucified.
Who was it that got crucified upside down?
Peter.
Let's go, Joe.
Come on, man.
Joe Rogan.
Come on, Joe been peeking.
Joe!
He got a Bible. Someone gave him a free Bible. He's been peeking a little bit.
Well, that's not in the Bible. That's in church history. But Joe is asking
peeking something.
the right question.
Yeah.
He's around. So praise God. Praise God. Hey, we're going to come back and we're going to get to the part where Wes asks Joe on who he thinks Jesus is. But before that, listen, I love you guys. I love hanging out with you guys. I think this is incredible. But I want to hang out with some of you guys in person at our Bless God Summit. And if you can't afford to go, we're about to announce 20 people that are going to get the scholarship. Okay. We got a sponsor that came in. That's confirmed, right?
Yep.
So Zach's about to announce his name. So if you can't afford to go, sign up for the scholarship. Here's a little more information about that. And we're going to come right back. I'm excited to bring you guys our very first 3-day conference called the Bless God Summit, happening March 27th, 28th, 29th in Southern California. And at this conference, we'll have your very own Preston Perry.
Me as an evangelist, I've made it up in my mind that I'm not going to leave people with an excuse not to serve Jesus.
Dr. Sean McDowell.
If there's one thing Christians should care about, it's truth.
Our vision with this conference is to equip, empower, and inspire people to do the work of the ministry that God has for them in this time. And at this conference, we'll have your very own Alan Parr and his wife, Jim Parr.
The number one reason, people want to get divorced because they want to find someone else who can make them happy. Now, what they don't realize, they're chasing the wind.
John McCrae from What Do You Mean?
What you may be shocked or you may not be shocked to know is that the majority of Christians in America, they don't know how to articulate the message of the gospel to non-believers.
Lila Rose.
Love and marriage go together, that sex and marriage go together, that sex can bring life into the world. And that's an amazing thing. That's not a bad thing.
Trizzle Fitness.
Most people fail at dieting because they're just trying to lose weight too fast. What are you in such a rush for?
But where a lot of people get stuck is figuring out what it looks like to walk in that. And so these 3 pillars of our conference will be covering everything from apologetics to family in the home and the marketplace, and how you can lean into those 3 pillars to discover your calling on this side of eternity.
Was it because like regular crucifixion wasn't good enough for him, or what was he didn't deserve it because Christ had gone through it?
Well, so the story is that they say we're going to crucify you, and he says it's like too big of an honor to die like my Lord, and they say, well, we can fix that.
Oh, Jesus. Shut your mouth, buddy.
Listen, the Romans were pretty brutal.
Oh, yeah.
But this is why we know, like we have, it's interesting. We know a lot about crucifixion, but crucifixion was seen as so disgusting. I believe it was Cicero who said that like the word crucifixion shouldn't even be on a Roman man's lips.
Jeez.
I mean, the word excruciating,
Right.
X is off of in Latin, and crus, off the cross. So that's where we get that word, is because this was designed to
crazy.
humiliate.
That's crazy.
And it was designed to be as painful as possible. There was actually a really good article done by JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which was done by a number of, I think it was in the 70s or the early 80s. It was done by a group of biblical scholars and then medical professionals. And so they looked at the conventions of what we do know about Roman crucifixion, and then they looked at the descriptions in the gospel to try to figure out, okay, if we could diagnose how Jesus died, how would he have died? And so they basically came up with this idea that he probably asphyxiated to death. You kind of drown in your own blood.
It's a dark way to go.
Just from blood filling your lungs
Yeah. Yeah. And they say once they pierced the side of his
with a spear.
Then blood came out, and that's how they knew he was dead, because blood came out of his lungs.
The chances of Jesus surviving the crucifixion, I think, are narrow to none. And the chance of him appearing 3 days later completely fine. I mean, if the first thing you do, if you survive a crucifixion and then you go and you find your disciples, the first thing you say is not, peace be with you. It's get me to a hospital. Right?
Did they have them back then?
No, not
Is
really.
also, are we entirely certain?
Why is that such a good casual moment?
Excuse me.
No.
It's just great. This is why Joe Rogan is great. He just
yeah.
asks good questions.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Of their measurement of days?
So this is an interesting question because of the differences between when the Gospel of John says Jesus died compared to the Synoptics, because John appears to be using the Roman convention of counting time, and the other Gospels, when they describe the timing, appear to be using the Jewish ones. And actually, if you correlate between the two, they match up pretty well. So the thing is, with Jews, any part of a day was considered a day.
Always goes back to the Jews.
Cue Candace Owens.
So 3 days and
about the
3
Bible, dude.
nights becomes almost an idiom for any part of that day is the day. So if Jesus, and because they count evening and morning, evening to morning is the day, it's very possible that it wasn't like how we would think of 3 24-hour days, especially if he dies on Friday and wakes up on Sunday.
So that would actually make it less time than more time.
Yeah,
Rose
they're
on
all-
the
it's
third
not
day.
like-
Rose on the third day.
So it'd be 2 days of being dead. Yeah.
Get recovery time.
Oh, no, he didn't have recovery
That's
time.
what I'm saying. That's what I'm
Yeah.
getting. It's not like it was 3 days. It was actually 3 months.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No,
So
not like that.
then 400 people saw him afterwards.
That's the claim that Paul makes.
Paul makes his claim.
Yeah.
And how many different people have some sort of a recollection or a writing or something that's attributed to them of being witness to his resurrection?
Well, you have Peter, Paul, Jude, James, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The thing with Matthew, Mark, and Luke is that Matthew and John are attributed to direct disciples of Jesus. Luke and Mark are not. So they are not eyewitnesses within the Jesus community. In fact, Luke prefaces his gospel by saying that. He's right up front about this. He's like, hey, I'm not an eyewitness. Don't confuse me with an eyewitness. He uses writing conventions of the day that would fit within regular biography that was written within the Roman world. So you have a guy named Quintilian who is basically, I mentioned it before, with the he's teaching people how to write. And he says that if you're going to write biography, you need to be interviewing eyewitnesses and you can't be too far away from the event to be able to write these things. And Quintilian, Lucian...
Pause it. Which, by the way, when you think about it, 2 of the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses, 2 of them aren't. This is not how you would orchestrate this story.
100%. And like he's saying, like Luke or the author of Luke wouldn't say, oh, by the way, I'm not an eyewitness. Let's not be confused as an eyewitness.
Yeah, this is not how you would write it.
They would hide.
You would probably, if you were trying to create a fake forgery, you'd probably just write books from the perspective of Jesus.
You'd Billy Carson it.
Yeah, you Billy Carson.
and
More
Josephus,
straight.
who are all these very prominent ancient biographers and writers of history, have a lot of crossover in the way they describe how you should write history with the words that Luke uses at the beginning of his gospel, where he says, I'm interviewing eyewitnesses and I'm writing up an orderly account. And so he's saying, I'm going to use these methods that are expected as good history of my day. I'm not an eyewitness, so I'm going to try to find the people who are eyewitnesses, and I'm going to try to encapsulate this within a document that communicates what is being written.
So we have an account of the resurrection. Do we have an account of the denial of the resurrection? Is there an historical record of him just dying and this, like a refutal or a rebuttal rather to what they're saying?
No, the only ones from the ancient world that deny his resurrection are groups that come on afterwards that sometimes are described as Gnostics, and they're not necessarily just denying it for the reasons we might think they were. They're denying it because they have incorporated ideas of pagan philosophy where they believe that the spiritual is good and the physical is bad. So if Jesus was crucified, let me back up. If Jesus is God, he cannot have a physical body. So they deny that he actually had a physicality to him.
Which, by the way, a lot of the Gnostic writings...
That's what the Gospel of Thomas is.
That's what the Gospel of Thomas is, which, by the way, Alex O'Connor, please stop quoting the Gospel of Thomas. A lot of the writings are what went on to inspire Muhammad. And his recollection of what the narrative of the New Testament is oftentimes a Gnostic version.
Which is why Jesus was a prophet in there.
And Jesus couldn't have been God.
Wow.
And Jesus couldn't have been the Son of God.
Wow.
Right? And so it's interesting how the heresies and the forgeries of that went on to inspire a whole nother
and look at the fruits
worldview and look at the fruits of Islam. Two, the idea of natural bad spiritual good, that's not exclusively a separate syncretistic way. That infuses a lot of Christians. That infuses the doom and gloom. Jesus is coming back, so I don't give a crap about my life. I want to do whatever I want to do. And this stuff has to get rebuked in the New Testament. Like 1 John, I believe, is writing to rebuke the Gnostics.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot of stuff that is writing to in the scriptures that they had to rail against Gnosticism because it was so prevalent. Now, Gnosticism isn't a monolith. There isn't a set standard of beliefs, but it's based on these ideas that spiritual good, physical bad. It's about gnosis. It's about knowing more, getting more information, so on and so forth.
Sometimes called Docetism, because dokein in Greek means to seem. So these groups that we describe as the docetics, they are denying that Jesus had a physical body. He only seemed to have a physical body. And they wrote documents later on. So the Gospel of Peter, which comes around in 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, is being written, and it has Jesus kind of chilling on the cross because he's not really physical because he's divine, and physical entities don't have physical bodies. So we don't actually get like a concrete denial of his resurrection in that way until you get things like the Gospel of Barnabas in the Middle Ages, which...
Shout out Billy Carson.
Shout out Billy Carson. and again, what is the Quran denies the resurrection.
Yep.
The Quran also denies the death. They said it just seemed like Jesus was crucified, right?
Which is like against all
it's Gnosticism.
historical.
Yeah, it's all, that's the stream that it comes from. You know what I mean? Because remember, even 500-600 years later, it wasn't like everyone had access to a New Testament Bible like we have access to today. Like we are so privileged with the amount of biblical resource we have, and we take it for granted. But that's even when they were on the scene, they didn't have easy access to the scriptures. They had a lot of forgeries, a lot of the Gnostic nonsense.
It's actually the document that Billy brought up to me in the conversation we had is the evidence that Jesus was never crucified, the Gospel of Barnabas. Well, Gospel of Barnabas is 15th century. It paraphrases Dante's Inferno. It's not an ancient document.
Whoops.
So, but in the ancient world, nobody really had that big of a problem with these kind of supernatural claims. The more of the kind of skepticism was why you would worship a crucified individual to begin with.
Wow. So they were less surprised that he was resurrected.
Or that you would worship a crucified like teacher was just seen as silly.
Because it's so humiliating to be crucified.
Yeah. And that like a god would let himself go through this.
Right.
Like what are you talking about? In fact, the ancient world didn't really have a problem with supernatural events. There is an ancient writer who mocks Christianity, and he particularly mocks Christianity in saying that, of course, Jesus did miracles because Jesus had a childhood in Egypt. And he goes, all of those Egyptians are magicians anyways. So he just learned the magic when he was a child. So
wow.
That sounds like Billy Carson.
That's crazy.
Again, more strays of Billy Carson.
So
they didn't have, by the way, and neither did the Romans. The Romans didn't have an issue with Christians worshiping Jesus. They worshipped all kinds of gods. Their issue was when you stop saying Caesar is God.
So it's funny because Joe is looking at this through the lens of like a modern skeptic, where he's like, well, is there any counter literature saying that he didn't rise from the resurrection? What does that say? And it's like, that wasn't even an issue to be addressed because people were just like, I mean, yeah, crazy things do happen.
Crazy things happen.
But why are you
Miracles happen.
worshiping a weirdo that got crucified?
Yep. It's crazy.
And so it's like it's not a definitive something that says Jesus didn't resurrect from the dead. Or that he did resurrect from the dead because people didn't write about it. But it does go to show that there wasn't anything significant that people felt like they had to go speak out at the time and say, well, all these people, we know they're lying. We wrote something factual stuff about it. Instead, everyone's just like, you're probably telling the truth. We just think you're weird because you're worshiping a crucified person.
Yeah.
Nuts.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out the video. Please be sure to comment below and subscribe and all that good stuff. And check out this other video that YouTube seems to be recommending just for you. Let me know if they nailed it. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.